Today in the EU leaders gather with firm message, Russia must not prevail. Today, the heads of EU countries will gather in Brussels to discuss further long-term military aid to Ukraine, enlargement and farmers' requests. But the crux of the discussion shifts from the EU having to support Ukraine by all means to a much less nuanced one, Russia must not prevail. Hello and welcome, I am Eva Vittori and this is Today in the EU. We invited in our studio Alexandra Brzozowski, Euractiv's Global Europe editor, to break down today's summit. Alex, welcome back.
Hi, Evie. Good to be back.
The big guns are out, with EU leaders descending to Brussels this afternoon. This is the last regular EU summit before the European elections, so very important. What can we expect?
Hopefully not too many fireworks, if you ask some EU diplomats and officials. It's the third summit that will see a strategic debate on Russia's war in Ukraine. We had the December summit deciding on the greenlighting of EU accession talks. We had the February summit that saw the deal on the 50 billion financial aid to Ukraine. So now this third summit is supposed to see leaders discuss how military support to Ukraine can be made more sustainable and long-term. And you remember we discussed the agreement for the Ukraine Assistance Fund earlier this week. So that's kind of already green-lighted. So the formal steps are theoretically done. But what EU leaders will face now will be some guiding questions in the more strategic debate. And the guiding questions are essentially, are we winning this war and are we delivering enough support for Ukraine to prevail? And essentially also that will include a strategic debate of where do we see this going in the next few weeks and months, also considering the shortage of ammunition on the Ukrainian side and the rather acute situation of them being still outgunned and outnumbered towards the Russians.
And what do you think will be the main takeaway?
One of the big takeaways will not really be what will be written on paper and in the conclusions in the end, but whether the sense of unity can hold. And some EU leaders surely will also have in the back of their heads that the Russians potentially might start an offensive earlier than May or even earlier than what the Ukrainians are anticipating. So this will also drive the conversation.
But let's stay on this a little bit more and zoom in on some of the phrasing of the summit conclusions and the framing of the debate. What's your take on the way language has moved?
So according to the latest draft conclusions that have been circulated to the press, EU leaders are expected to say that they give urgency to the situation and are determined to continue providing Ukraine with political, financial, economic, humanitarian, military and diplomatic support, so the full range, for as long as it takes and as intensely as needed.
This week is an important week for Ukraine and our support to Ukraine, because on Monday, a couple of days ago, at the Foreign Affairs Council Minister, we adopted the Ukrainian Assistance Fund.
Mentioned Josep Borrell, EU's High Representative during the EU-Ukraine Association Council.
It's, again, one of the variations of the Draghi style, whatever it takes phrase we've heard over the past 2 years. So essentially nothing new, but a reiteration of what has been there.
So what is new?
What is new and probably interesting in the context of the next few months is that they are also expected to state that Russia must not prevail. We've had one EU senior official describing the phrase as beautiful.
Si la Russie gagne cette guerre, la crédibilité de l'Europe.
If Russia wins the war, Europe's credibility will be reduced to zero. If Russia were to win the war, the lives of French people would change, said specifically Emmanuel Macron during an interview on the 15th of March.
That kind of gives you the idea where that might be coming from.
And is it really beautiful?
Well, I don't think possibly we can say that yet. But what we see from such linguistics is also that next to finding the physical means to support Ukraine, the language is moving as well.
You're referring to unity, but in the run-up to the summit, we saw somewhat gaping differences between Germany and France on Europe's strategic goals in the current situation. Why is that?
Yes, indeed, especially after French President Macron's comments on the potential Western troops on the ground in Ukraine and also German Chancellor Scholz's immediate shooting down of the idea. What we will watch at the summit is probably how they can patch things up. There has been a lot of crisis diplomacy being made over the past few weeks, including by European Council President Michel and also by Poland's Prime Minister Tusk. Macron, for many member states, has kind of transformed from dove to hawk in a very short period of time. So
interesting phrasing again.
Something that obviously has been welcomed by Ukraine's staunch supporters in Eastern Europe, but also in some other places. So it will be interesting how that discussion plays out in the EU27 context. And the key question you hear from EU diplomats is essentially how much of Macron's newfound positioning is purely politics and how much is actual commitment to the cause.
And what are the others saying on this?
One problem is maybe that there are too many people that are reacting a bit allergically to such ad hoc proposals of his. But while there are clear differences, I think, also between Macron and Scholz, they do have the same objective, namely that Ukraine has to prevail. Though I think very few EU leaders have so far been able to decisively say publicly on the record, except maybe some Eastern Europeans and Nordics, that Ukraine needs to win this war. Mm-hmm. So that's where we come back to linguistics. But if the declared strategic goal is that Russia must not prevail, win, however you put it, then to achieve that, the options must be on the table. And it seems that that is something that is increasingly discussed also between EU leaders. And in that sense, it will be very interesting to see what messages come out from that summit.
And what about Hungary? Do they share the same objective?
Well, Hungary's Prime Minister Orban has never really said that Russia should win the war, right? So in some sense, the strategic discussion now that we will have at the summit was something that he has been asking for a while. It will be interesting to watch what kind of messaging comes from him, but so far he has not put any conditions to any wordings or
no controversies there.
So we will see how the discussion goes.
The other significant debate is expected on European security and defense. Can you break down for us the game plan Europe is rolling with now?
Earlier this week, European Council President Michel sent an op-ed to us and some other media publications across Europe and has essentially called for Europe to be defense ready and a shift to a war economy mode. That came just before the EU summit. Not everyone agrees with such a view. I mean, we do see quite some differences between member states to approach the current situation, because many of them argue as well that raising defense spending does not equal a war economy, in which you would submit the market economy to defense funding.
And what can we make out of this?
But what we understand is that essentially EU leaders are more and more facing the question how to pay for the shift that is clearly driven by the need and the threat perception that we have. But what we can expect them, I think, to discuss also from the decisions that have been prepared in the past few weeks is that they might want to come up with creative ways how to fund without injecting fresh money. So one is on using proceeds of frozen assets for funding Ukrainian weapons, a proposal that member states received yesterday. And the other one is more of a long-term look to see how the European Investment Bank can be a bit more flexible in lending policy and definitions of dual-use equipment. So there is other ways to go beyond the fresh money debate for now. Mm-hmm. But again, I think the outcome of the discussions will be interesting.
Mm-hmm. Now, another topic very close to your heart, enlargement, seems to become a bigger issue than initially intended. Where do you see the sticking points in the debate?
Absolutely. So EU leaders indeed might face a tough call today whether to move with the next steps for Ukraine and Moldova or risk a delay until after the EU elections in June or maybe potentially even later this year, and also tie that with progress on Bosnia and Herzegovina to get candidate status. All of this might complicate things even further. Mm-hmm. They were initially not expected to go into detail and only take stock of the progress made, and the actual reform discussion, especially the EU internal reform discussion, was something that was meant to be tied with the June summit and the EU strategic agenda for the next commission. However, and this is again something that we hear now before the talks, according to EU diplomats and some other officials we've spoken to, is expected that there might be a longer discussion in the cards, especially if they follow through with Bosnia. The country is one step behind Ukraine and Moldova, but the opening of accession talks was made conditional to the country completing some reforms that have been spelled out by the European Commission last November. So many member states are actually not fully convinced that they have achieved them.
The decision on Bosnia and Herzegovina came a bit out of nowhere and as a black horse.
We have decided to open accession negotiations with Bosnia and Herzegovina once the necessary degree of compliance with the membership criteria is achieved.
Highlighted the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen on the sidelines of last December's European Council. What was that about?
It was indeed quite a surprise, I think, for long-term observers, since the country's enlargement report noted rather limited progress on the issue, particularly on electoral reforms. But over the past week, several people we spoke to have also expressed concern that essentially with that recommendation to open the accession talks, the Commission would move away from the merit-based process that they have been upholding for the last years. So some have accused the European Commission to be politicizing the process. So it will be really interesting to see how this debate goes, how maybe Bosnia will be tied, the progress on Bosnia will be also tied to Ukraine and Moldova, which has been a demand by some member states. But in the end, I think the general goal is to move forward with enlargement rather quickly, especially when we think about the uncertainty after the EU elections, after the US elections, with the new commission as well in November.
And even though we love the intricacies of geopolitics, what else should we keep an eye on regarding the leaders' discussion?
Agriculture could be a bit of a wild card. We've seen the months of protests in Europe on the roads and with tractors, and the also unexpected political foothold in the February summit conclusions, where farmers essentially came back to the agenda. EU leaders are expected to give their blessing to some initiatives that are already underway. We think of cutting red tape, strengthening the position of farmers in the food supply chain, and also when it comes to fair competition, not only in the internal market, but also globally. Plus, to address also the side effects of trade benefits to help Ukraine in a fair and balanced way. So beyond those rather general calls, if they go beyond that, it might get complicated. One official that was involved in the preparations told us that the summit might risk ending up turning into a summit of rural anger.
We actually did an episode on this exactly with our agri-food editor Angelo Di Mambro. So if you want to dive a bit more in the agriculture side of the summit, give that episode a listen.
So I'd be definitely looking for some tractors around the EU quarter later this evening, probably.
Oof, interesting. Let's see. Thank you very much, Alex, for joining us today. I am Evi Chiori, and this was Today in the EU. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed yet, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever it is that you get your podcast. This episode was produced by myself, Miriam Saenz de Tejada, and Nicoleta Yonta. Thank you for tuning in. We will be back tomorrow. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.